right, welcome to our last piece of Unit 4. This is the part 2 of the Jacksonian era piece here. Last we left off, Jackson had just gotten elected and he was beginning his time as presidency after the election of 1828. Now, you read about Jacksonian democracy for your homework last night, but we need to talk about it a little bit more. When we look at Jackson getting elected and how he got elected, Martin Van Buren is going to be monumental in getting him elected. So he gets rewarded under that spoils system with the position of Secretary of State. Secretary of State was incredibly important because it was the stepping stone to the presidency. So Van Buren said, I want the Secretary of State position because I want to be president when you're done. Now, when we compare John Quincy Adams' presidency to Jackson's presidency, it's important that we look at this major point here. Jackson kept calling Adams this aristocrat, this elitist, this corrupt politician. But under Adams, he fills maybe a dozen government positions with his own officials. Under Jackson, you see hundreds of government jobs being filled with Democratic supporters under the spoils system. So, who really is that corrupt politician when you look at the numbers? Jackson's cabinet is going to be filled with all of his supporters to the point where we start calling it the kitchen cabinet, because many of the people who were put in his cabinet weren't qualified for the positions, but they had helped him get elected, and he promised them under the spoils system to reward their loyalty, and he does just that. Jackson claims that before him, politics was corrupt, that nobody could do it like he did it, that he was going to be this new face to the presidency. But he creates so that the government doesn't look better under him, where there should have been a rotation of government offices to make sure that the democracy, the people's voice is being heard. That's not quite happening when we're pushing all of our loyal friends into positions. So while Jacksonian democracy sounds like a great idea, he actually carrying it out during his presidency didn't look like what he had campaigned. Where he campaigned to fix all of politics, he really fills it with more corruption. Now, when we look at who supported Jackson and who didn't support Jackson, his base, his following, is going to be in the South and in the West. Now, Jackson promised the people of the South that he would remove the Native Americans from the region because the Native Americans were sitting on land that the farmers wanted. It was very fertile, it was a lot of land, and fertile land meant money. So the South wanted Jackson to push the Native Americans off that land. Jackson was a perfect person to do this because he had won in the Seminole Wars. He had defeated the Creek tribe and the Seminole tribe before. So his supporters said, okay, we'll just do it again. When we look at these Native Americans in the South, though, they weren't what people deemed them to be. They had remained and started to adopted different aspects of white culture. We even called these tribes the 5 civilized tribes, and these included the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, and Seminole tribes. Now, when I say they adopted aspects of white culture, I mean they practiced Christianity, they established a schooling system, they owned private property, they had formed their own constitutions, they had written republican forms of government, and they even had their own writing system. So when people referred to these Native Americans as savages and that they needed to be moved because they were a danger, that's not what we're talking about here. The Native Americans had evolved, and they had evolved to quote unquote fit the white mold of what we wanted. But this didn't stop the Southern whites because the Southern whites wanted that land. They didn't care if the Native Americans looked just like them, acted just like them, talked just like them. What mattered at the end of the day was the land that they were sitting on. So the Southerners are going to insist that the Native Americans are not civilized. They could never be civilized enough to live next to them, and they're going to try to continue to push for the Native Americans to move. Now, I need you to put a star next to this in your brain because this case is always asked about in the Regents. This is called Worcester, and I know it looks nothing like Worcester, but it is Worcester versus Georgia, and this is going to happen under the Marshall Supreme Court. And what happens here is we are going to have a group of Native Americans who are appealing a case to the Supreme Court to keep their land in 1832. Now, what had happened was that the land had been taken uh, by the state governments, and under that, the Native Americans are saying it's unconstitutional for the states to take land from the Native Americans because the federal government had treaties with the Native Americans, which meant that the federal government is superior to the state government and should be protecting the Native American land from the states who are taking it from them. Now, this is a case that boils down to the Supremacy Clause. Federal treaties with the Native Americans are supposed to be superior or above the states who are trying to take their land. So the Native Americans have a case here. And remember, Marshall favored the federal law. So Marshall is going to side with the Native Americans, stating that yes, the federal treaties are superior to the states, and the states cannot take the Native American land. But this is not going to stop the removal of the Native Americans, because remember, Jackson wants to keep his support, and he wants to keep the support of the South. So Jackson's response to John Marshall's decision is, and I quote, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." This is a quote that the Regents likes to use because it points out that the powers of the different branches cannot or are limited to certain means. So the Supreme Court cannot enforce the law. Remember, the Supreme Court is a part of the judicial branch. The judicial branch is the judge of the law, they interpret the law. The legislative branch makes the laws, and the executive branch enforces the laws. So when Marshall makes his decision, the president is supposed to enforce it, the executive is supposed to enforce it, but Jackson doesn't want to. So instead, Jackson is going to push Congress to pass what's called the Indian Removal Act. And this is as simply as it is, it's stated just like this. The Indian Removal Act said that they were going to peacefully negotiate the exchange of land in the South for new land, which is called the Indian Territory. So what this means is the law itself on paper says that the Native Americans are basically going to trade their land. They are going to give up their land in the South, and they're going to go to the Indian Territory. So it's land for land. But the difference between these two lands is huge. They're moving from areas like Georgia and Florida to Oklahoma. Now, the land is completely different. That would mean they have to change the houses that they live in. They have to change the clothes that they wear. They have to change the food that they grow. They have to change the animals that they hunt. They have to change their entire way of life. And remember, the Native Americans have been here longer than we have. So when you just say, okay, you have to up and move and change everything that you've ever known, it's not that easy. And the Choctaws and Chickasaws are going to, or the Chickasaws and the Choctaws are going to be forced to leave their lands, and they don't have the option to stay. if they stayed, they were facing violent treatment by whites that wanted their land. We are going to see the Indian Removal Act also be applied to the Cherokees. Now, the Cherokees, there is going to be a group in 1835 of Native Americans that go to the government and negotiate payment for Cherokee land. But those that went to the government were not real representatives of the Cherokee people. They were defectors looking to make a quick buck and to make a name for themselves. They weren't true representatives of the people. But because the government was hearing what they wanted, the government takes the land anyway. And in 1838, U.S. soldiers are going to force 16,000 Cherokees to walk, and I mean walk, from their lands in the southeast part of the nation. And we're going to look at these territories in just a second on a map. And they're going to force them to walk to Oklahoma. This is hundreds of miles that they are walking. And you can see in the picture there and the picture on the previous slide, they were walking with whatever they could carry. They were walking with whatever goods they had. It was pack up your home and let's move. And this becomes known as the Trail of Tears. In this walk, you're going to see thousands die of starvation and exposure because they are walking. They are not stopping at hotels to take a break. They are continuously being forced to walk. Women, children, elderly being forced to walk. In 1836, the same thing is going to happen to the Creeks. They are going to be forcibly removed from their lands. The last group that we look at between 1835 and 1842 are the Seminoles, and they are going to be forced from their land as well. But they do not leave as easily as the Creeks and the Cherokees had. The Seminoles stay and try to fight for their land, and these conflicts become known as the Second Seminole War. But in the end, the Seminoles are also forced to leave. So the event that shows that the Native Americans were forced to move to the west is the Trail of Tears. And you're going to read about the Trail of Tears for your homework tonight. Now, to be clear, to look at this map to see exactly where we're moving from, these are the trails that we are walking. The red trail is the Cherokee Trail of Tears. So you're walking from Georgia to the Indian Territory, which is modern day Oklahoma. This is hundreds of miles, okay? Hundreds of miles that they are being forced to walk. They're not driving in cars, they're not on trains, they're walking, which is why many die of exposure. And you can see that the blue arrows are going to be where the Seminole, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw are also moving to the Indian Territory. Now, I need you to think about this as well, because we're seeing all of these different tribes moving to the same territory. These different Native American tribes have different languages, they have different religions, they have different methods of farming, they have different histories, they have different cultures, and they're all being shoved into this one Indian territory. I know it looks like a lot of territory, but you're taking many different backgrounds and pushing them to live all in one place, which is creating kind of a, a, a place for disaster when you're putting all of these people who have been wronged and they don't necessarily like each other out in the West and just kind of saying, okay, here you go. You're going to see conflicts among Native American tribes, and down the road, you're going to see the Native Americans start to push back because we continue to do the same thing over and over and over again. We take their land, we push them. We take their land, we push them. And this is going to be one of the last straws when we look into the future and conflicts between the Native Americans and the United States. Now, this concludes our unit for Unit 4. So I want you to think all the way back to the question that I asked you in the very beginning. How does the Constitution apply to the United States? Over this unit, we've seen the Constitution applied many different times. I want you to think of a time that it was applied, and I want you to think of how it was applied. And we'll use this question to start conversation the next time that I see you. Any questions? Let me know. Remember that tonight for homework you have the Trail of Tears reading.